So now we already learned quite a bit about Redux, but up to this point we always just worked with our single counter value. Now I got this toggle counter button here, and when it's clicked, I want to make sure that the counter is hidden, and when it's clicked again, it should be shown again. Now for this, of course, we could use state. So we could set up some local state in this component, which we manage with useState, not with Redux. And that would be the proper way of doing it, because showing or hiding the counter is something which only is interesting to this component, not to any other part of the application. But the same could be said about our counter. We are only using the counter in this component here. So the counter technically also is local state. But this is just a simple demo to get started. So let's assume that both the counter as well as the state, whether the counter should be visible or not, is a global state, which is also interesting to other components, even though that's not the case here. As we progress, once we know these basics, we will of course also work on demos and projects where this then really is the case. But for the moment, let's assume it. So when we click this button, the toggle counter handler is fired, and then here we want to dispatch an action which changes some state in Redux, which controls whether this counter div is shown or not. For this, we need to add a new state, a new piece of data to our Redux store. And how do we now do that? Well, to add a new piece of data, we need to go to our reducer in the end and just add it to all these state snapshots which we are producing. Let's start with the initial state snapshot. When we start, besides having a counter which has a value of 0, I want to have a show counter field which has a value of true or false. That's up to you. And to keep this a bit more readable, I'll extract that and store that in a constant named initial state like this, and assign initial state here then, just to make this a bit easier to read. Now when we increment, we are changing the counter. We don't care about show counter. We still need to set the show counter property here though, because we are returning the overall state object, and Redux won't merge your changes with the existing state. It instead takes what you return and replaces the existing state with it. More on that in a second. But for the moment, let's just accept it, and let's set show counter here to state show counter. So to the value we currently have in our state. Because for increment, we don't want to change it, so we will just take the existing show counter value. And we can do the same here for increase, because there we also want to keep the existing show counter value. And do the same for decrement here. But now I will also handle a new action type. And by the way, since we have many if statements here, we could also use a switch case statement, but I will stick to multiple if statements here for now. And in this new action type, I will check for, let's say, toggle. Now the identifier, just like all these identifiers, is up to you. I'll go with toggle and then return a new object. Here we now want to change show counter and set it to the opposite of what it was before. If it was true, we want to set it to false. If it was false, we want to set it to true. We can do this by simply adding an exclamation mark and then accessing state show counter. This will invert the value. Now for the counter itself, we want to keep the existing state because we don't want to change this here for this action. So we just set counter to state counter. Now we also support this new toggle action type, and hence back in counter.js, in the toggle counter handler, we should dispatch such an action. We dispatch a new action object where the type is toggle. Now we can take advantage of this toggle state, so of the show counter state, and for that we need to get access to it. So also in the counter, we again call use selector, We can use this multiple times to retrieve different pieces of data from the state. And here I'm then interested in my show counter piece of data. And I'll store that in a show constant. The constant name, of course, is up to you. Now again, that will then always update and the component will be re-evaluated whenever that data, which we're accessing here, changes. So now here with show extracted, we now can render this div here conditionally by checking if show and only rendering the div if show is truthy. Like this. If we now save this and reload, if I click toggle counter, it's gone. If I click this again, it's there again. I can still increase it even if it's hidden, but it only shows up when I click toggle counter. So that now also works, and that is how we can manage multiple different pieces of data in our state. Of course, this data is still kind of connected. We have the counter and then the state whether we want to show it or not, but it's two totally different values which are changed in totally different ways. So therefore, that is how we can manage multiple pieces of data.